Long before mass protests and headline-making marches, one man was already dismantling segregation from the shadows. With nothing but his mind, the law, and an unstoppable will, Charles Hamilton Houston launched a quiet revolution inside America's courtrooms. You won't always see his name in the headlines or textbooks, but without him, the legal battles that toppled segregation might never have stood a chance. He cracked the foundation of Jim Crow piece by piece and changed the course of American history. This is the brilliant story of the man who killed Jim Crow. Show your support by giving this video a like and join us as we explore the remarkable legacy of Charles Hamilton Houston. Washington, D.C., 1895. It was a city where black excellence found rare space to breathe, home to a vibrant black middle class, prestigious schools, and a growing professional community. That's where Charles Hamilton Houston was born, on September 3rd, into a family that deeply believed in the power of education and the law. His father, William LaPrey Houston, was already a respected attorney. His mother, Mary Hamilton Houston, had been a teacher. Together, they raised Charles to see learning not just as a tool, but as a weapon for survival and progress in a country that had no intention of making things easy for him. From the beginning, Houston stood out. He attended M Street High School, one of the finest schools for African Americans in the country, later known as Dunbar High. It was not merely an educational institution, but a sanctuary nurturing black aspirations in an era dominated by segregation and racial injustice. Immersed in an environment filled with passionate teachers and ambitious classmates, Charles started to envision a future beyond their society's limitations. At just 16 years old, Houston packed up and left D.C. for Amherst College in Massachusetts. It wasn't an easy transition. He was the only black student in his class, often excluded socially, left to navigate the cold world of elite academia on his own. But he didn't just survive, he dominated. He graduated magna cum laude in 1915, joined Phi Beta Kappa, and was one of 6 valedictorians. His commencement speech quoted Paul Laurence Dunbar, the black poet whose work spoke to pride and perseverance. "We wear the mask that grins and lies." That very moment revealed a lot about who Houston was becoming. Someone who wouldn't let prejudice silence him, even if he had to speak through metaphor and intellect. After Amherst, Houston returned home to teach at Howard University. He was only in his early 20s, but already shaping young black minds. Then, in 1917, the United States entered World War I. Despite knowing how unjustly black soldiers were treated, Houston chose to serve. He joined the first officer training camp for African Americans at Fort Des Moines and earned a commission as a first lieutenant. Soon, he was in France, serving in the segregated army and seeing up close the contradictions between the ideals America preached and the realities it enforced. These early years weren't simply about achievement. They were the furnace in which Houston's sense of purpose was forged. His intellect, sharpened by adversity, refined by education, and tested through the fires of war, now prepared Charles Hamilton Houston for the battles ahead. In war-torn France, Lieutenant Houston discovered that wearing the U.S. uniform did not shield him from American racism. The Army was rigidly segregated. Black officers like Houston were often treated with contempt by white officers and soldiers. On one disturbing occasion, Houston narrowly escaped a lynching attempt by fellow American soldiers. His offense had simply been talking with a white French woman, which so enraged some white troops that they threatened his life. The young Houston was stunned. Here he was, willing to die for his country, yet facing hatred from those he fought alongside. "The hate and scorn showered on us Negro officers by our fellow Americans," he later wrote, "convinced me that there was no sense in my dying for a world ruled by them." In the trenches and towns of World War I, Houston saw clearly that the enemy of equality was not only abroad, it was at home in the form of entrenched racism. The harsh realities and discrimination Houston faced on the battlefield became the forge that shaped his moral resolve. He left the Army in 1919, returning to the U.S., just as the post-war racial violence of the Red Summer of 1919 erupted. Black veterans across the country were being attacked for daring to wear their uniforms and assert their rights. This turmoil only steeled Houston's resolve. It had given Houston a personal understanding of injustice. He had seen black soldiers court-martialed unfairly and relegated to menial tasks, and he had himself been denied the basic respect due an officer. Houston emerged from World War I with a fierce determination to change the system that treated black Americans as second-class citizens. His battlefield was no longer the trenches, it would be the courtroom. That fall of 1919, Houston kept the promise he made to himself in France. He enrolled in Harvard Law School. He arrived in Cambridge carrying the weight of what he had seen in the war, resolved to acquire the tools to wage a new kind of battle. As he would later say, the experience of army segregation convinced him to devote his life to fighting for those who could not strike back. The military had altered Houston's worldview permanently. He now viewed the law as his weapon of choice, one he would hone with precision in the years to come. Cambridge, 1919. Charles Houston was a pioneer once again, one of only a handful of black students at Harvard Law in an era of pervasive prejudice. He was older than many classmates at 24 and battle-hardened by his Army service. At first glance, Harvard's imposing halls might have seemed as imposing as the Army's hierarchy. Houston faced subtle and overt racism here too. Classmates and even some faculty doubted whether a black man belonged. But Houston was determined to excel on merit. He poured himself into his studies, often working twice as hard to earn his place. His effort paid off brilliantly. Houston not only earned his Bachelor of Laws degree in 1922, he went on to achieve the Doctor of Juridical Science in 1923, becoming the first African American to earn that degree at Harvard. Even more famously, he became the first black student to serve on the editorial board of the prestigious Harvard Law Review, a position of high honor. Years later, Professor Randall Kennedy recounted Houston's own words in a letter home about the Law Review. "The editors didn't want me on. They know I am just as independent and a little more so than they," Houston wrote defiantly. If others tried to exclude him, he would simply outperform them. This became a hallmark of Houston's career, the belief that black lawyers must be exceptional to tear down the walls of racism. Houston's brilliance caught the attention of Harvard's elite faculty. Legendary legal figures like Professor Felix Frankfurter and Dean Roscoe Pound noticed his work. With their support, he won a Sheldon Traveling Fellowship after graduation, allowing him to travel to Europe and broaden his legal education. Houston used it to study civil law at the University of Madrid in Spain in 1924. This international perspective further rounded out his expertise. By the time he returned home in 1924, admitted to the Washington, D.C. bar, Charles Hamilton Houston was one of the most highly trained young lawyers in America. Back in Washington, Houston joined his father at the family law firm, which they aptly renamed Houston and Houston. It was one of the first black law firms in the city, and young Charles brought to it the fire of his new mission. In those early years practicing law in the 1920s, Houston also began teaching part-time at Howard University's law school. Howard University, the historic black university in D.C., had a law program that was then unaccredited and offered only evening classes. Houston saw an opportunity. Howard could become the training ground for a cadre of black lawyers dedicated to civil rights. In 1929, Howard's president, Mordecai Johnson, appointed the 34-year-old Houston as vice dean of the law school, effectively its acting dean. It was at Howard that Houston would mentor a generation of black attorneys, most notably a young man named Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall arrived at Howard Law School in 1930 after being denied admission to the University of Maryland Law School because of his race. At Howard, Marshall found in Charles Houston a mentor like no other. Houston was tough and demanding with his students. He famously warned them that lawyers are either social engineers or mere parasites, urging his students to use their degrees to engineer social change rather than just seek status or profit. Marshall absorbed Houston's philosophy deeply and thrived under his guidance, graduating first in his class in 1933. The mentorship between Houston and Marshall was not just in the classroom. Houston often took Marshall along to observe real cases and even to help with research on civil rights lawsuits. In one notable instance in 1933, Houston insisted on an all-black legal defense team, including Marshall, to defend a black defendant in a high-profile Virginia murder trial. It was a risky move in the segregated South, but Houston wanted to show that black attorneys could handle the toughest cases. Marshall later credited Houston's rigorous training for his own success as a lawyer. Indeed, Marshall would go on to argue Brown v. Board of Education and become the first black justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, fulfilling the legacy of Houston's mentorship. When Charles Houston walked the halls of Howard University School of Law in the early 1930s, he carried himself with what one colleague called an aristocratic austerity, always in a crisp suit, projecting discipline and purpose. Houston's mission at Howard was bold: to transform this modest night school into the West Point of civil rights training. He believed passionately that black lawyers had a special duty to fight for their community. A lawyer's either a social engineer or he's a parasite on society, Houston wrote, driving home his point. By social engineer, he meant a lawyer who uses skill and knowledge to tackle social problems, to re-engineer society toward justice. Any lawyer who wasn't doing that, in Houston's eyes, was wasting their talent, or worse, abetting an unjust status quo. This philosophy became the creed at Howard Law School. To achieve his vision, Houston did not hesitate to make drastic changes. He abolished the part-time evening program and made Howard Law a full-time, rigorous course of study. This move was controversial. It forced some students who could only attend at night while working jobs to drop out. But Houston felt it was necessary to elevate academic standards. He revamped the curriculum, emphasizing constitutional law and civil rights. He even fired faculty he deemed subpar and expelled students who did not meet his exacting expectations. To some, these measures seemed harsh or elitist, and indeed Houston was a perfectionist. However, he believed that black lawyers had to be twice as good in order to break the barriers of segregation. As Professor Kenneth Mack noted, Houston thought it important for black people to be better than white people by the white people's own standards, a stance that was controversial but effective. Under Houston's leadership, Howard's law program gained full accreditation by the American Bar Association and the Association of American Law Schools by 1931. Howard Law graduates, once not even admitted to many state bar exams, were now recognized nationally. More importantly, Houston imbued his students with a sense of purpose. He would hold intense seminars where students debated strategies to attack unfair laws. Outside of class, Houston would lead students on field trips to observe segregation in practice, visiting local courts, police stations, and schools to see how the law treated black citizens. Thurgood Marshall, Oliver Hill, James Nabrett, Spotswood Robinson, these future civil rights giants were all molded by Houston during this period. It was here that Marshall learned how to build a case file to challenge a racist law, where Hill, who would later help win Brown, learned to see the law as an instrument for equality. Houston's approach was also collaborative. Knowing the American Bar Association barred black members at the time, he helped found the National Bar Association in 1925, a professional organization for black lawyers. He created a network of attorneys who could support each other in civil rights cases. Houston also constantly stressed that legal battles did not stand alone. They needed public support. Lawsuits mean little unless supported by public opinion, he wrote, noting the gap between the law in the books and the law in action. In other words, winning a case was only half the battle. One also had to win hearts and minds. This holistic view of advocacy, combining legal brilliance with public education, would soon define Houston's next chapter as he left Howard's campus to take on Jim Crow in the courts. By the mid-1930s, Jim Crow laws, which legalized segregation and discrimination primarily in the South, were firmly entrenched, affecting every aspect of life from schools to transportation to housing. Charles Hamilton Houston set out to attack this system at its weakest points, using the Constitution as his sword and shield. In 1935, Houston accepted a new role as the first special counsel, or lead attorney, for the NAACP, the nation's leading civil rights organization. He left his teaching post at Howard to head a concerted legal campaign against segregation. Houston's former student, Thurgood Marshall, joined him in this effort. Together, they developed a shrewd long-term strategy, Rather than directly challenging the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson doctrine of separate but equal and risking an early defeat, they would chip away at it case by case. Each lawsuit would target a specific inequality, creating legal precedents that expose the contradictions and injustices of segregation. Houston decided that education would be their primary battleground, particularly graduate and professional schools. Why? Because inequalities there were blatant and easier to prove in court. Many states provided no facilities for black students to pursue higher degrees, yet denied them entry to white institutions. If he could force courts to rule that these situations violated the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause, it would begin to undermine Plessy's core idea. Houston famously traveled around the South with a camera in hand, documenting the deplorable conditions of black schools: leaky roofs, hand-me-down textbooks, no libraries or laboratories, compared to well-funded white schools. He turned some of this footage into a film to bolster his cases and rally black communities, unmasking the lie of separate but equal in vivid detail. Discrimination in education, Houston argued, is symbolic of all the more drastic discriminations which Negroes suffer in American life. To curb the young blacks and prepare them to accept an inferior position without protest or struggle. By focusing on schools, Houston aimed at the heart of Jim Crow's future, the aspirations of the next generation. One of Houston's earliest and most significant victories was Missouri ex rel. Gaines v. Canada of 1938. In that case, an African-American student named Lloyd Gaines was denied admission to the University of Missouri's law school because of his race. Missouri had no law school for black students. Instead, it offered to pay for Gaines to attend law school in another state. Houston saw this as an ideal test. Standing before the U.S. Supreme Court, he argued that Missouri's refusal to educate Gaines violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. If the state provides legal education to whites, it must provide equal facilities to blacks within its borders. The Supreme Court agreed. In a landmark decision, the court ruled that Missouri had to provide Gaines a legal education substantially equal to that of whites. And since no black law school existed, Gaines had to be admitted to the white university. This victory was a crack in the wall of segregation. It didn't explicitly overrule Plessy versus Ferguson, but it made clear that states could not shunt black students aside or send them away as a substitute for equality. Houston's strategy was working. He had established that separate facilities must truly be equal, or else integration was required. And given that creating genuinely equal facilities was extremely expensive, this approach began to make segregation economically and legally untenable. After Gaines, Houston, and the NAACP legal team pressed on with a string of cases targeting segregation in higher education. They challenged the University of Maryland Law School's segregation and won an order admitting black student Donald Murray in 1936, a case argued by Thurgood Marshall in Maryland's courts. They took on admissions at the University of Texas Law School in Sweat versus Painter, and segregation within the University of Oklahoma's graduate programs in McLaurin versus Oklahoma Board of Regents, both of which reached the Supreme Court in 1950. In these cases, decided just after Houston's death, the court ruled that forcing black students into separate facilities or isolating them with special restrictions was inherently unequal because it harmed their educational opportunities. For example, in Sweat, decided in June 1950, the court looked not just at tangibles like buildings and books, but intangibles like networking, reputation, and alumni influence, and found that a hastily created black law school in Texas could never match the University of Texas Law School's quality. Likewise, in McLaurin, the court said that making a black doctoral student sit apart from white classmates in a colored desk in the hallway unfairly hindered his education. These decisions built squarely on the groundwork Houston had laid. They recognized that segregation itself imposed inequality, even if material facilities seemed equal. Or, as Houston had prophetically written, there is no such thing as separate but equal. Segregation itself imports inequality. While education was his primary focus, Houston also struck blows against Jim Crow in other arenas. He argued labor rights cases like Steele versus Louisville and Nashville Railroad Company, where the Supreme Court ruled that labor unions could not exclude black workers from fair representation, a victory guaranteeing black employees a voice even in segregated unions. He fought housing discrimination in cases such as Hurd versus Hodge, in which the Supreme Court declared racially restrictive covenants, agreements barring black people from owning or occupying homes in certain neighborhoods, unenforceable in court. Houston's fingerprint was on almost every major civil rights case in the Supreme Court from the mid-1930s to 1950. In total, he argued 8 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court and won 7 of them, an extraordinary record. Each case chipped away at the legal logic of second-class citizenship. Perhaps Houston's most enduring contribution was the team he built. By 1940, health problems and exhaustion led Houston to step back from his official NAACP position, and Thurgood Marshall took over the helm of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. But Houston did not retire. He continued to advise behind the scenes and to take on selective cases. The legal blueprint he drafted carried on, case by case, court by court. The NAACP team was tightening the net around Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, to understand why Charles Houston is called the man who killed Jim Crow, one must appreciate the broad scope of his war on segregation, especially in education. Jim Crow was the nickname for the system of laws and customs enforcing racial segregation in the South and beyond since the late 19th century. Jim Crow meant black and white children could not attend the same schools, black patrons had to sit in the balcony at theaters, black travelers rode in separate train cars, and even black taxpayers' dollars built parks they couldn't enter. Houston recognized that this system rested on an uneasy legal lie, the Plessy doctrine of separate but equal, and he set out to reveal the lie for all to see. He said it plainly: segregation's purpose was to curb black ambition and social equality by denying equal education. If that pillar could be destroyed, Jim Crow would crumble. In the 1930s and 1940s, Houston crisscrossed the country like a civil rights general, coordinating with black lawyers in different states to file lawsuits and gather evidence. He often traveled by car through the Deep South, a black man with northern license plates, carrying a camera and legal pads, driving on dusty back roads to visit dilapidated black schoolhouses. These journeys were not without peril. The segregated South was hostile to outsiders probing its racial order. Houston and his colleagues sometimes had to sleep in their cars or in black families' homes because hotels refused them. But the evidence they gathered was damning. In one county, black children attended classes in a drafty shack with broken windows, no desks, and hand-me-down textbooks, while just down the road, white students enjoyed a sturdy brick schoolhouse with new supplies. Such scenes were common. Houston's film and photographs of these conditions were shown in church basements and community meetings, galvanizing black citizens to support the NAACP's legal fights. They also provided compelling exhibits in court, forcing judges to confront the stark inequality. Houston also tackled teacher salary disparities. In many southern states, black teachers earned far less than white teachers with the same qualifications. Lawsuits in Maryland, Virginia, and elsewhere, often assisted or inspired by Houston's strategy, won equal pay rulings, thereby attacking another facet of educational inequality. Each small victory against a Jim Crow policy built momentum and morale for the broader fight. By the late 1940s, Houston's legal war against segregation in education had built to a crescendo. The NAACP, now led by Thurgood Marshall, launched direct challenges to segregated elementary and high schools, something Houston had cautiously delayed until the climate was right. In speeches, Houston emphasized that the fight in the courts was part of a larger tapestry of black struggle. "We cannot separate the school fight from all the struggles to eradicate the other evils the black man suffers," Houston wrote. He saw the battle against Jim Crow education as inseparable from the fight against economic injustice, voter suppression, and racial violence. Houston's influence went beyond legal briefs. He became a beacon of hope, demonstrating in court that segregation could be overturned and inspiring millions to believe in change. Black newspapers started calling the NAACP legal team Houston's Brigade. When one case was won, Houston would urge the community not to become complacent. "We must remain on the alert and push the struggle farther with all our might," he wrote during the campaign. Houston had a keen sense of timing and strategy. He picked cases that would set useful precedents and avoided ones that might create bad law if lost. This discipline sometimes frustrated those who wanted quicker, more sweeping action, but Houston was playing the long game. He was, as one historian put it, an architect of social change, drafting blueprints for dismantling Jim Crow piece by piece. By 1950, Jim Crow's foundation was visibly cracking under the pressure of Houston's strategy. The cumulative effect of the education cases was that the Supreme Court had essentially gutted separate but equal for graduate and professional schools. Black students were gaining admission to previously white-only universities in small but significant numbers. The public was beginning to see the hypocrisy of segregation. How could a democracy that had just fought World War II for freedom abroad continue to deny basic rights to its own citizens at home? Charles Houston didn't live to see the final demolition of Jim Crow in education, but the arsenal he built was about to be deployed in the defining case. Behind Charles Houston's stern, methodical exterior was a man who bore enormous personal burdens. He worked punishing hours for years on end, often at great cost to his health and family life. Colleagues noted that Houston would stay up late into the night poring over legal briefs, then catch an early train or drive hundreds of miles to counsel a local lawyer or meet with community leaders. The stress was unrelenting, but so was Houston's drive. His wife, Henrietta Williams Houston, and their young son, Charles Jr., saw less and less of him as he threw himself into the fight. Houston also struggled with the shoestring budgets of the NAACP in those days, often covering travel expenses from his own pocket or sleeping in cramped quarters to save money. By the late 1940s, the years of sacrifice began to take a physical toll. Houston suffered from heart disease, a condition likely exacerbated by exhaustion. In 1949, he had a serious heart attack that forced him to slow down. Even then, he refused to quit the struggle entirely. He spent his recuperation advising former students on upcoming cases and writing letters with strategic advice. In one such letter in August 1949, Houston wrote about how tight the time was to complete the mission, urging his protégés to carry on the work if he could not continue. Friends like William Hastie, himself a pioneering black jurist and one of Houston's closest colleagues, grew concerned. They saw Houston driving himself relentlessly, as if racing against the clock. Tragically, their worries proved prescient. On April 22, 1950, Charles Hamilton Houston died of a heart attack at the age of just 54. The news sent shockwaves through the civil rights community. It was a cruel twist of fate. The man who had orchestrated the long campaign against school segregation passed away just as ultimate victory was coming into sight. In June 1950, barely 6 weeks after Houston's death, the Supreme Court announced its decisions in Sweatt v. Painter and McLaurin v. Oklahoma, two major blows to segregation in higher education. Houston had anticipated these fights, prepared the groundwork, and even helped on Sweatt behind the scenes, but did not live to see the rulings. NAACP leader Roy Wilkins lamented that Houston missed by only a few weeks the announcement of the victories for which he almost literally gave his life. Indeed, many who knew him believed Houston's single-minded devotion contributed to his early death. At Houston's funeral in Washington, D.C., former students, colleagues, and family gathered to honor a fallen general of justice. Judges and lawyers, black and white, paid respects. One of the most moving tributes came from Judge William Hastie. Reflecting on Houston's leadership of the long legal campaign, Hastie said, "He guided us through the legal wilderness of second-class citizenship. He was the Moses of that journey." In those words, Hastie likened Houston to the biblical figure who led his people toward the promised land. It was a fitting analogy. Houston had led countless lawyers and clients through uncharted territory in the courts, ever closer to the promise of equal justice. Though he could not enter that promised land himself, his followers would soon walk the final steps without him. Houston's death was not just a personal loss to those who loved him. It was a loss to the nation. Yet, even in mourning, there was a sense of resolute determination among his protégés to finish what he started. Thurgood Marshall, grief-stricken but steadfast, redoubled his efforts for the upcoming cases challenging school segregation at the elementary and high school level. The fight would go on, and it would honor Charles Houston's legacy. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered the unanimous decision in Brown v. Board of Education, declaring that segregated public schools are inherently unequal and unconstitutional. In the courtroom that day sat a team of NAACP lawyers: Thurgood Marshall, Robert Carter, Spotswood Robinson, Oliver Hill, and others, many of whom had been students or junior colleagues of Charles Hamilton Houston. When Chief Justice Earl Warren read the historic verdict, effectively overturning Plessy v. Ferguson, there was jubilation. Marshall and his team had won the victory of a lifetime, and in that moment, Houston's spirit loomed large over the proceedings. Brown was, in many ways, the capstone of Charles Houston's life's work, achieved by the very people he had trained and inspired. Thurgood Marshall never forgot who paved the way. He often credited Houston as the architect of the legal strategy that led to Brown. "We wouldn't have been anywhere if it hadn't been for Charlie," Marshall asserted in various tributes, echoing his famous quote that Houston laid the groundwork for all that followed. The broader civil rights movement also acknowledged Houston's foundational role. In the years after Brown, as the Montgomery bus boycott, the Freedom Rides, and the March on Washington unfolded, activists knew that the legal vindication of their rights in courts was possible, largely because Houston had so effectively eroded Jim Crow's legitimacy. Charles Hamilton Houston's legacy in American legal history is truly both profound and enduring. He was posthumously awarded the NAACP's Spingarn Medal in 1950, recognizing outstanding achievement by an African American. Howard University named its main law school building Charles Hamilton Houston Hall in 1958, ensuring that each new generation of lawyers at Howard studies in the house that Houston built. Harvard Law School, his alma mater, established the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice in 2005, carrying forward his mission of using law to advance racial equality. Numerous scholarships and awards bear his name across the country. In 1983, the United States Postal Service honored Houston with a commemorative postage stamp, cementing his status as an American icon who, though once unsung, is now widely celebrated. History fittingly crowned him the man who killed Jim Crow, a title that captures how his tireless legal battles delivered the fatal blow to segregation. Jim Crow did not die in a single day or from a single blow. It was a slow death by 1,000 cuts, many of them delivered by Houston and his legal protégés. By the time Brown v. Board of Education struck the final blow, Jim Crow's legal edifice had already been fatally weakened by the precedents Houston set. As a result, Brown not only knocked down school segregation, it also set the stage for dismantling segregation in all public facilities, and it energized the civil rights movement, leading to landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Beyond the court victories and honors, Houston's legacy lives in the very idea of the lawyer as a social engineer. He demonstrated the power of a single dedicated individual to design and implement a strategy that changes the course of history. Generations of lawyers, especially African American attorneys, have looked to Houston as a role model of using one's profession in service of a greater cause. Each time a civil rights lawyer stands before a judge to challenge an injustice, whether fighting racial discrimination, gender inequality, or any other form of inequity, Charles Hamilton Houston's legacy flashes alive. It lives in the understanding that the law can be a weapon against oppression, and that with skill and unwavering commitment, it is possible to rewrite the rules of a society. In one of his writings, Houston asserted, "Without education, there is no hope for our people, and without hope, our future is lost." He viewed education as the central pillar of freedom and progress. Because of Houston, millions of children were eventually able to attend integrated schools where that hope could flourish. His life's work ensured that the American ideals of justice and equality applied a little more to everyone, not just the few. Today, every American who attends an integrated school, serves on a diverse jury, or lives in a neighborhood of their choice owes a debt to this towering yet humble figure. Houston's legacy is all around us in a more just society, a living, breathing monument far more significant than any statue. And that is why Charles Hamilton Houston will forever be remembered as the man who killed Jim Crow. If this history moved you, please take a moment to like the video. It helps more people discover stories that often go untold. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the Black leaders, movements, and moments that shaped our fight for justice. And if you know someone who should hear Charles Hamilton Houston's story, share this video with them. The more we remember, the more we can build on the progress made. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.